Hello again. This is Laurel Lindstrom speaking with the Sitting Comfortably podcast. We are reading the Draftsman from my first novel, due out next January, which is forever away. I thought it might be interesting to do a series of podcasts so that you could read the book without reading it, in fact, by listening to it. We've done many of these podcasts now. I think we're up to the end of chapter 5, and this podcast is chapter 6. So, are we sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. The Draftsman, chapter 6, Letters. And once upon a time, long since gone, long since away and dead, Martin's mother gazed, dewy-eyed, and said to her husband, "Oh, look, he's got a little stiffy." And Caroline Cox leant over to kiss her darling boy, his small fists gripping tight to her fingers. "Who'd have thought it in a baby barely a year old? What's a stiffy?" came Alison's slightly rasping voice as she stood in the doorway to watch her parents playing with their son. Alison knew she had to stand at the doorway because her mother had told her that it's important not to get too close to her brother in case he caught her cold. "He's only a baby, Alison. He's not as strong as you." She knew that the baby was important, but not as important as her, because her mother had told her so, and she knew that what her mother said was always right, because her dad had said so. He'd told Alison, and he's told her mother, many times, even swearing about it. "You're always right, aren't you? Always bloody right," he had often said, so Alison knew it was right to believe him. As she stood there watching and waiting for an answer to a question she was already forgetting, her feet were getting cold in her fluffy slippers, and her nose was starting to run again. She saw her parents, like bookends, bolstering the child, laid on the bed between them, and wondered when it would be time for tea. Alison was hungry, and the thought vanquished her question, which they hadn't answered anyway. "What's for tea? Do I have to have tomato soup again?" And her father picked up the baby as her mother watched with wistful eyes, while he wrestled with the nappy and Martin twisted and turned. Her mother came to the door and steered her off towards the stairs, the dark shadows closing behind them as they headed towards the stairs and down to the downstairs light. "Tea's on the way, dear, and I think you can probably manage a bit more than soup, eh?" Alison jumped and squeaked, "Yes, please." It was so long ago, a moment in time that Alison never fully remembered, and that her father preferred to forget. Or perhaps it was just denial. "If I ignore it, it'll just go away." When Martin's dad protested, she would say, "What harm, eh? What harm a little kiss?" And she was right in a way, except that the little kiss did not settle and remain confined in that one loving moment. Martin was 4 or 5 when he started to remember her kisses, her frowning concern for his silence, his glance flat and emotionless whenever she called his name. "Poor darling, you mustn't do that, it's naughty." And she would take his hands away. "Let mummy rub it better." And then tell him to go and play outside. Martin did as he was told, as Alison said he should do. He did as he was told and stood still in their small back garden, watching the sky and feeling an alien sensation gradually subside. Martin's mother signed for the letter that arrived at 151 Glenkiln Drive. When Martin came home that night, she asked him what it was, and with exquisite joy he looked out from behind his hair and almost lied to her for the very first time. Another, very different, but equally alien sensation. "It's just something to do with work, something I need to look at." "But why did they send it here, Martin? Why not to the office? And it looks important." "Oh, it isn't really. It's just some stuff I have to read, and they sent it here because I am on holiday next week." the almost lies coming thick and fast and intoxicating, he added, "I'm not going to be at the office. I'm on holiday." She stared, reaching out to touch his arm, but he pulled it away instinctively, automatically now, and she had no means to hold him. "But Martin, you never said you were going on holiday." Such a clever boy. This lie was her own making. He had never said he was going on holiday. "Not," he said, "I didn't." And he took the envelope and went up to his room to read the letter, the contract and the guidance notes that his new friend Joshua was to have provided. Then, only a handful of years after that first contract had arrived, another letter had come. This time it arrived at the squalid flat with its sumptuous expanse of dirty carpet, a mess and rank stink, a view across the park, and the same two people. They had been following the same routine too. Just like today, Martin had handed Joshua the box file and knocked a stack of corners on the floor. 16,384. Cigarette in hand, he had sprawled across his sofa, his knee bent, ankle to thigh, black jeans peppered with dust and minuscule flakes of ash, teeming with microbes, his cigarette-less hand clasping his hair tight to his head. But the letter on that day had been about much more than the desk or the contract. It too was from Bill, and Joshua had read and reread this second letter in silence, his lips slightly mouthing the text, eyes darting along the lines. He finished reading and looked up at Martin, his eyes round, his hand trembling slightly as he cleared and cleared again a desiccated throat. Wow, this is one we need to think about. He looked down again at the page, swallowing, rubbing under his chin with the back of his hand as he felt the sweat patches slow seeping under his arms. His heart had started to pound and his blood was surging, booming loud and hot in his ears. The slow beetroot flush was spreading and creeping across his skin. With a tingling touch, it moved up under his jaw and tickled at his already engorged and simmering earlobes. Joshua's hands were now visibly quivering, and his hold on the letter tightened, as if to stop it floating away, as if to be sure it was really there. He had wanted to wait for Martin to take the lead, but couldn't help but to blurt out, "My God, they're actually doing it. They're actually selling up. Blast is being acquired." Stunned and dizziness rising, he looked at Martin, staring at the ceiling, vacant, detached. "And I guess you're being acquired with them. My God, this is incredible. You know what this means for you," he had said. Supine on the sofa, Martin's face was slowly tightening into a frown, his eyes sapphire hard, pushing to black, his cigarette burning, ash dropping. "Are you sure about the contract? Absolutely certain?" he said, low, and his voice touched with iron. The reply, rapid fire, "Don't even think about it. It's rock solid." They were suspended together in another moment, framed in crystal lines and energized, the cracks in the space around them appearing only to shatter the moment in silent explosions. A memory of his first meeting with Clive and Richard when that long ago, long gone instant, framed in crystal lines, had appeared when shock and disbelief had exploded into nothing, and all because the sandwiches had arrived. Martin looked up at Joshua and across this new landscape as reality marched slowly into something tangible, a collection of immutable facts. "Martin, don't worry about the contract, but you've got choices to make. You've got decisions to make, you know. This is a whole other order of magnitude. They'll be putting your head into all sorts of devices and you'll still be getting 5% of revenues. Your print head. He looked blankly at Martin. rapid-fire shots into the charged silence, ripping it to shreds, ripping all of it to shreds. Barely comfortable on the new map, a whole other geography was waiting to be navigated. Joshua was still talking, mainly if you want to exercise the opt-out. And Martin Cox, silent and now staring at the drifting tones of his tar-stained ceiling, as Joshua carried on, excited and simmering with an uncontrollable energy. The rising presence of his voice was pressing hard against the edges of Martin's every nerve. Rat-tat-tat-tat, the voice accelerating from sharp shooter staccato almost to a burbling, garbled rant, a blur. You know your only obligation if you don't opt out is to attend one board meeting a year as long as Blast remains autonomous. And Martin Cox, now shaking slightly, silent still, listened with growing relief as the tide of words became almost incoherent, just waves of noise turning and splashing onto the battered air. The torrent of hyphenated nonsense soothed Martin, and he could open his eyes and give a tolerable impression of one who is engaged, eyebrows raised, head nodding gently, mouth making interested shapes as Joshua's words came into tighter focus. So it's not much different from what you have to do now, but if Blast doesn't stay autonomous and get sucked into the buyer corporation, why don't they say who it is? Your contract's only about money. The structures you'd have to work with will get disappeared, and if they're just buying Blast for its patents and people, yeah, do you see? A wall of words Martin had eased himself to the top of, and he saw. He understood, and still staring back at Joshua, he answered, yes. And he stubbed his cigarette out on the carpet. Now the two of them trod that letter's legacy. The letter about collecting the desk, the final paycheck, marked an ending that had started the day with that very first letter, the one that Martin's mother had signed for, unaware of its significance or of how their lives were about to change. With Shadowhurst in his life, as well as the London flat, the whole routine was different. Martin would finally stop going to work, stop the good morninging and occasional goodbying. He'd give up the infrequent sojourns into Wimbledon wine bars and long walks on the common in the dark. He'd stop drawing lines, stop finding resolutions in black and white. He'd stop holding on to the chains that bound his crippled identity. But at what cost? Or would there be a prize, instead, to stop being who he had always been? What would come next? They too sat staring across the room for what seemed like hours before Joshua recovered his grip. Right, I'm off. Got a squash game. Fancy joining me? Martin raised an eyebrow and lit another cigarette. You can tell me about it sometime, he said. They stood up and Martin took the letter from Joshua's outstretched hand. Yes, what happens next is what we don't know, but I'll tell you, and once it's happening, you can tell me, and about the squash. Martin turned his back. Conversation over. Later, on the squash court, 9-2 down, but 2 games up, Joshua remembered. Since when was Martin interested in squash? That's the end of part 1 of chapter 6. I hope you have enjoyed it, and we'll be posting this second part to chapter 6 sometime soon. I hope you're enjoying the whole book, and any comments you'd like to make, I'd be very happy to take on board. The book is, as I say, it's in production, but that doesn't mean we can't change anything if you think something sounds weird or confusing. So, till next time, thank you very much for listening.